Okay, something a little bit different today. This is a video for, well, it's aimed at a particular class really. It's aimed at 8A3. The rest of Year 8 can watch this, of course, but it's aimed really at 8A3. Taught you guys yesterday, and we were looking at Henry and the break with Rome. We're going to do more on that next week, and I will do a video on the break with Rome next week or the week after, quite soon. Because you will need to revise that for an assessment coming up. There's a surprise for you. But in that lesson, on the lesson that we did, Henry and the break with Rome, you guys were full of questions all about Henry VIII. Not all of them were relevant to what we were doing. So what I've decided to do is a video that answers some of the questions that you guys had. Now, the important thing to remember is not everything I'm going to talk about in this video will be relevant to your assessment that you'll be doing in a couple of weeks, and it won't be relevant to the end of year exam. So, you know, this isn't a video for revision or homework or anything like that. Some of the things I'll talk about today are relevant, and hopefully they'll ring some bells from the lesson that we had the other day. But a lot of things I'll mention today, it's just to answer the questions that you guys had, the general questions about Henry VIII, and about the things that we weren't focusing on in that lesson. This is a much easier way of getting those answers out, rather than you guys spend about half an hour with your hand up in class, waiting for me to answer, or maybe never getting an answer if we're wasting time and we need to get on with some work. So, as I say, this video is aimed at aimed as a bit of a fact file, really. That's what I'm calling it, fact file on Henry VIII. Okay, as I say, I'm going to focus on some of the areas that you guys had questions about. Remember, this isn't going to be coming up on a test. It's not going to be a homework or anything like that, but hopefully it'll answer some of the questions that you had. So, Henry VIII. Well, first of all, he was King of England, obviously, from 1509 until 1547. Okay, he was the second son of Henry VII. Okay, so Henry VII was the king before him. Henry VIII was his son. Okay, he was the second son. I've underlined that for you. He was the second son of Henry VII. His older brother, Arthur Tudor, was supposed to be king, but Arthur had died before he could become king. He died of something called tuberculosis, which is a lung condition. Okay, quite a nasty one. And Arthur had died of tuberculosis, and naturally Henry, as the next oldest son, went on to become king when his father died, when Henry VII died. Henry became king, as I mentioned before, in 1509. He was only 17 when he became king, so not that old. Okay, now let's talk about one thing that you guys were full of questions about, and that is Henry and his wives. He had 6 wives. I'm going to very briefly talk about all 6. One by one, and I'll start naturally with wife number 1. And remember, we talked about these first 2 wives in quite a bit of detail. You do need to know a little bit about his first 2 wives and the situation surrounding them. The first wife was Katherine of Aragon. Katherine of Aragon. So we talked about her quite a bit in the lesson. Remember, he was married to her for 20 years. They were married for a very long time, 20 years. She was the daughter of the Spanish king and queen. Now, I told you this in lesson, remember, Katherine of Aragon had been married to Arthur Tudor, Henry's older brother. So she'd been married to him before, and they'd been married for about 6 months when Arthur died. So when Arthur died, Henry wanted to marry Katherine, or rather Henry VII, remember Henry's father, the king, wanted him to marry, because it made sense at that time for the English king, or future king, to make links, in this case through a marriage, with Spain, because Spain were a very powerful country. So if Henry VIII, Henry Jr., could marry Katherine, it would unite the 2 countries. It would unite England and Spain, both of whom could be allies together, and it would be a powerful team. Okay, so when Arthur died, Henry had to get special permission from the Pope to marry Katherine, and he got it, which meant that when he eventually wanted to divorce Katherine 20 years later, he had a problem because the Pope said, whoa, you got special permission to marry Catherine in the first place, and now you want to divorce her? Not too happy about that, so I'm going to say no, you can't divorce her. The Catholic Church, remember, wasn't too keen on divorce, full stop. But they really weren't keen on Henry VIII, who'd got this special permission to marry Catherine of Aragon, basically throwing it back in their face and going, look, I know it's been 20 years, but I don't want to be married to her anymore. Now, we talked about this in the lesson. Why did he not want to be married to Catherine of Aragon after 20 years? Well, that's because Catherine had only given Henry one surviving child, a child who survived infancy and grew up, and that was Mary, a daughter. Catherine had not given Henry a son, and he really wanted a son. He wanted a king to carry on his dynasty, his family dynasty. Wasn't too keen on women ruling, being queen. Okay, he wanted a son to be king. So Catherine hadn't given him a surviving son, and she was getting too old to have children. Okay, so at the point where Henry wanted a divorce, Catherine couldn't have any more children, so he said, I want to divorce Catherine and I want to marry Anne Boleyn. We talked about this in the previous lesson. I'll talk about Anne Boleyn in a second. So she's the one of two wives that you really need to know about Catherine of Aragon. You need to know about the situation involving Henry and Catherine and why he wanted to divorce her. I've just explained it. And you do need to know a little bit more as well about Anne Boleyn, wife number 2. Here we go, Anne Boleyn. So, Henry married Anne after he had divorced Catherine of Aragon. And with Anne, he had another daughter, Elizabeth, who survived infancy, but there were no surviving sons, no sons who survived infancy. Okay, so this displeased Henry. He divorced Catherine to marry Anne so he could have a son, and Anne hadn't given him one. Now, Anne was executed in 1536 after being accused of adultery. Adultery is cheating on your partner, having an affair. Now, Anne said she was innocent, said that she hadn't cheated on Henry, but she was found guilty and was, as I say, executed in 1536. She had her head chopped off. She was beheaded, which meant Henry was single again. And he then, very quickly, married Jane Seymour, wife number 3, Jane Seymour. Now, Jane Seymour was the only wife to give Henry a surviving son, a son who survived infancy and grew up. And that son was Edward, who would go on to become Edward VI of England. Okay, so Jane gave him a son. She gave birth to Edward, and just 2 weeks after giving birth to Edward, very sadly died. So she'd given Henry what he wanted and then had died, which made him very upset, obviously. And he is buried next to Jane Seymour, indicating that she was his favourite. Okay, partly because she'd given him a son, but also because I think he was quite deeply in love with her. So after Jane had died, Henry then again was single and got quite lonely and sort of advertised for a wife. I don't mean he took an advert out in the paper, but kind of made it clear that he wanted a fourth wife to grow old with. And so many women around Europe were sending things to Henry, letters and paintings saying, please marry me. One woman who sent Henry a painting was Anne of Cleves, who went on to be his fourth wife. I'll hold that up there, Anne of Cleves. Now, I very briefly mentioned this the other day to you guys, year 8, made you giggle a little bit. Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves had a portrait commissioned, so she got a man to paint her portrait. And the good thing about getting your portrait painted is if you maybe pay the artist a little bit of money, a little bit extra money, they can make you look much better than you actually look. And this painter was quite clearly very gifted because he made Anne of Cleves look very beautiful on her painting. And when she sent the painting to Henry and Henry saw the painting, he said, wow, she's beautiful, I want to meet her, I want to marry her, so send her over. She was German, by the way, she lived in Germany. So when she came over from Germany and met Henry, he was quite disappointed because she did not resemble the woman on the portrait. And in fact, Henry is quoted as saying, she looks like a horse. Okay, which isn't very nice. But he still married her. That's the funny thing. He still married Anne of Cleves, despite the fact that she allegedly looked like a horse. But the marriage was very quickly annulled, okay, which is a little bit like a divorce. It basically means the marriage is cancelled, okay. So the marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled. He essentially got divorced from her, and then he moved on to wife number 5, Katherine Howard. Now, Katherine Howard was 30 years younger than Henry when she married him, full of life. That life was very quickly taken away from her after she cheated on Henry, and she admitted to it, unlike Anne Boleyn, who denied it. Katherine Howard actually admitted to committing adultery, to cheating on Henry, and she was also executed. She was executed in 1542, so executed for adultery in 1542, which then swiftly brings us on to wife number 6, whose name was Katherine Parr. Okay, Katherine Parr. Now, Katherine Parr, wife number 6, took care of Henry in his later years. By the time he'd married Catherine, he was quite ill, getting quite old, and she outlived Henry. So Henry died before she did. Okay, that's Katherine Parr. So those are the 6 wives. But remember, Henry is famous not just for having 6 wives. He's famous for many other things. One of those is something that you really do need to know about, and that is the break with Rome, the big religious change that takes place in England in the 16th century, okay, where England goes from being a Catholic country to a Protestant country. Henry, as we looked at in the lesson, establishes a new church called the Church of England. He does this so he can divorce Catherine of Aragon, because the Pope says you can't get a divorce. So Henry says, right, I'm going to open my own church, or start my own church, the Church of England, and then I can basically do what I want, and I can divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. It's a massive, massive change to England. England has always been Catholic, okay, or for centuries it's been Catholic. So it's a huge change when Henry does this, and it's, again, something you really need to know about, and something that he's very famous for. Okay, I will do a video, or make a video about the break with Rome, as I say, next week or maybe the week after. Okay, so you can revise from that as well. Obviously there's plenty of stuff in your book and in the Tudor booklet, which you should all have. Okay, so that's something that you need to know about, and something that he's very famous for. But what else was Henry famous for, or infamous for? Well, during his reign, something that he did quite often was go to war. And he tended to go to war, or the country that he went to war with the most was France. There were numerous wars with France, between England and France. If you'll remember, we mentioned this in the lesson the other day, that Henry used the money from closing down the monasteries when he changed the church, when he closed down the monasteries, when he stopped being Catholic, closed down the Catholic monasteries, and you'll remember he took the land from the monasteries, which he could sell on for more money. He melted down the gold from the altars of the monasteries. He took the lead off the roofs. He took the glass out of the windows and sold that. So he really milked the monasteries for all the money that they had. Remember, a lot of monasteries had rooms full of treasure and gold, which he also put in his pocket. It's a very large pocket. And he spent pretty much all of this money on his wars with France. They were very expensive and not very successful. Okay, so they cost a fortune, and he kept losing. Okay, so he wasn't particularly successful in that area, much like he wasn't particularly successful in marriage. Now, Henry, another thing that he's infamous for is his ruthless streak. Okay, he was a particularly ruthless leader. He is very famous for the amount of executions that he carried out during his reign. Now, we know already that he executed 2 of his wives, which again is pretty ruthless. But just 2 days after he'd become king, he had 2 of his father's unpopular advisors arrested and then imprisoned and eventually executed. So straight from the word go, Henry was this ruthless king, having people arrested, imprisoned and executed. In the 1530s, he executed a number of religious opponents, including a man called Richard Whiting. He even executed 2 of the people who had helped him early on in his reign, his chief advisors. One of them was Thomas More, and that's because, or Sir Thomas More, I should say, Sir Thomas More disapproved of Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, disapproved of the divorce of Catherine of Aragon and the closing down of the monasteries and the switch to the Church of England and the marriage to Anne Boleyn. So Thomas More didn't approve of any of that. So Henry had him executed. Another person who Henry had executed, and this man was mentioned in the lesson we had yesterday, Thomas Cromwell. Now, if you'll remember, Thomas Cromwell had been in charge of Henry's investigations of the monasteries. Remember, Henry asks Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cromwell's team, basically, to go around the monasteries of England and check for, shall we say, bad behaviour, things that monks shouldn't be doing. And Thomas Cromwell published a massive report on all of the monasteries in England, saying the monks are doing this, the monks are doing that, they're really misbehaving, they are stealing from people, or really not doing what they should be doing. They're not helping people out. They're actually being quite greedy. They're gambling, or they're drinking, or eating too much. Many other things, and we talked about this the other day. It'll all be in your book. So Henry eventually has Thomas Cromwell executed. So really ruthless people who've helped him, people who have been by his side and helped him with some major decisions and major changes. In the case of Thomas Cromwell, Henry has them executed. Okay, so really a person you don't want to get on the wrong side of. Other nasty things that Henry does, or extreme things that Henry does, in 1536, 30,000 people had joined a rebellion in the north of England called the Pilgrimage of Grace. Okay, this was essentially a protest against Henry closing down the monasteries and switching from Catholic to the Church of England. Now, Henry actually tricked the protesters, the people who took part in the Pilgrimage of Grace, and he said, I'll do everything you ask, but within a year Henry had arrested and executed the leaders of the Pilgrimage of Grace, people like Robert Aske, and again, that shows he's pretty ruthless. He says, yeah, I'll give you everything you want, and then within a year he's chopping their heads off. So hopefully this video has given you some idea as to who Henry VIII was, the kind of man he was. Hopefully it's answered some of the questions that you had in your heads that maybe I didn't get a chance to answer in the lesson because we were doing other things. As I say, you don't need to know all of that. This is just for your interest, because you were asking so many questions. The only things you really need to worry about in terms of lessons and assessments and end of year exams is the break with Rome. Okay, and as I say, I will do a video on that next week or the week after. We'll do some more work on it in lessons, but that's the only area that you really need to worry about in terms of Henry VIII. But as I say, hopefully this has helped answer some of your questions and cleared a few things up. Hope you enjoyed it. I will be making more videos over the next few weeks, so stay tuned for them, and I will see you soon.